A 16-year-old girl was forced out of her first-class seat just because she didn't look like she belonged there. The sound inside the international terminal echoed like an endless symphony. The rolling wheels of suitcases on gleaming marble floors, conversations weaving through overhead announcements, and somewhere in the mix, the faint heartbeat of a young girl walking quietly through the crowd. No one noticed her. No one knew that within just a few hours the name Tasha Holloway would become the epicenter of the entire aviation industry. Tasha was only 16, petite frame. Her hair was neatly braided. She wore an oversized gray hoodie, a navy backpack slung over one shoulder. Her eyes didn't carry innocence, but the quiet depth of someone who had learned to remain silent rather than fight back. Tucked inside her sleeve was a neatly folded boarding pass. Seat 3B First Class, a prestigious airline. That ticket was a graduation gift from a summer science program where Tasha had excelled. And the person who gave it to her? None other than her godmother, Evelyn Brooks, a woman famed not only for her power, but even more so for how she turned silence into action. Tasha boarded early. She quietly settled into her seat, placed her backpack at her feet, a book resting on her lap, and earbuds loosely hanging around her neck. She didn't attract attention, nor did she seek it. Her presence was so quiet one might mistake her for a passing shadow, but not everyone overlooked her. A flight attendant entered the first-class cabin, her steps firm, her gaze sweeping across each row. Blonde hair in a tight bun, her face perfectly made up but icy, her uniform crisp without a single wrinkle. A nameplate gleamed on her chest, Ms. Parker. When her eyes landed on Tasha, her lips curved into a thin smile, then vanished just as quickly. She stepped forward, stopping right beside seat 3B, leaned in slightly, and spoke in a voice not loud, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You're in the wrong seat." Tasha looked up, slightly confused. "I think this is my seat." 3BM's. Parker furrowed her brows, voice dropping lower. "This is the first-class cabin. Where's your ticket?" Tasha pulled the ticket from her sleeve and handed it over. Ms. Parker glanced at it briefly, her frown deepening. Her eyes no longer held simple scrutiny. They now brimmed with open suspicion. There may have been a system error. We don't usually have students in first class. The sentence trailed off, but her look said the rest. No one stepped in. A few passengers glanced over, then quickly looked away. Silence became a silent accomplice. "You need to move to the economy so we can continue the boarding process." Her tone now carried the weight of a verdict. Tasha stayed quiet. She looked around, searching for a kind gaze, but found none. She stood, didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't plead. She simply walked down the aisle between luxury seats, past averted glances and empty stares. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by a kind of humiliation she'd never been taught to deal with. She found an empty seat in economy by the window, sat down, placed her backpack at her feet. Eyes stared out toward the tarmac. Around her, the hum of the crew, suitcase wheels dragging, distant laughter, all of it muffled beneath the lingering echo of Ms. Parker's voice. "You don't belong here." But Tasha knew she had done nothing wrong. She hadn't broken any rules. She hadn't disturbed anyone. She had simply sat in her assigned seat, and that alone, was enough for someone to decide she didn't belong. She pulled out her phone. Her fingers slowly typed a message. She said, "I don't belong." I moved to the back. Send. The screen glowed for a few seconds, then went dark. Tasha didn't expect a reply. She just needed to say it, even if only in one short sentence. But when her phone buzzed quietly again, everything began to change. What happened? The voice of Evelyn seemed to pulse through each word, calm but forceful. Tasha responded slowly. The flight attendant made me leave first class. She didn't believe the ticket was mine. A brief pause. Then the reply came. Send me the flight number. She fumbled for the ticket, hands slightly trembling. Sent it. Within 10 seconds, her screen lit up again. Stay in your seat. Don't say anything else. I'll handle it. Tasha stared at the message. She had seen Evelyn handle serious matters before, at PTA meetings, school boards, and family gatherings with rude adults. But this time, this was on an airplane, in the air, in a place where no one could interfere. But Evelyn could. And she was. In the cockpit, the pilot was performing a final system check. The emergency communication light began to blink. A strange voice came through the headset. Hold position at the gate. The flight is under review by the FAA. Do not proceed to the runway. The pilot paused, glancing at his co-pilot. This wasn't a technical issue. This was a direct order from the Federal Aviation Administration. And in over 20 years of flying across hundreds of thousands of miles, he had never seen anything like it. The cabin lights were still on. The aircraft door had been closed for nearly 10 minutes, yet the engines remained silent. There was no familiar thud of the plane pushing back from the gate, no greeting from the cockpit, no announcement explaining why they were still on the ground. Passengers were growing restless. Some checked their watches, others flipped through their phones, trying to refresh their connections. But in the economy cabin by the window seat 27F, Tasha Holloway had already sensed something unusual, something no one else seemed to understand the way she did. She hadn't looked away from her phone screen where Evelyn's last message still glowed. Stay in your seat. Don't speak to anyone else, I'll handle it. Those final 4 words, I'll handle it, carried no promise. They were a command. And when Evelyn began a call, no one, not even the biggest airline in the country, could pretend not to listen. Meanwhile, in first class, Ms. Parker stood in the galley, holding a plastic cup of water, her eyes scanning the cabin as if looking for something that still needed to be corrected. She felt relieved, believing the incident was over, that everything had been handled internally, just as she had always done over the past 10 years. The girl will probably forget. No one cares about that stuff, she murmured, almost to comfort herself. But someone had seen everything. A young flight attendant named Luis, about 30, had been nearby when Tasha was told to move. He had seen the disbelief in the girl's eyes. He had seen her hand out her ticket, full of quiet trust, only to receive a dismissive shake of the head and a cold command. And now, as he watched Ms. Parker sip her water calmly, he couldn't stay silent any longer. You think it's over? Luis asked quietly. Ms. Parker glanced at him, lowering her voice. What did you say? That girl. I saw the ticket. It was real. You kicked her out just because she didn't look like someone who'd sit in 3BMs. Parker raised an eyebrow, her voice colder. I followed protocol. If there was an issue, you should have spoken up then. You didn't give anyone a chance to speak, Luis said, his gaze unwavering. You gave orders. Silence. Only the sound of the last sip of water in her cup remained. Ms. Parker turned away, but the confidence in her eyes had dimmed. Luis said nothing more, but his expression said it all. This isn't over. In the cockpit, the captain received a second call, this time from a different line. This is James Sandler, operations lead at the FAA. On behalf of Director Evelyn Brooks, we are requesting that the aircraft remain at the gate until our representatives arrive. There is a serious matter involving discriminatory conduct that must be addressed immediately. The captain closed his eyes for a moment. Evelyn Brooks was not a name he usually heard in standard procedures. It was a warning. "Understood. We will remain at the gate until further instruction," he replied, then turned to his co-pilot, who had just removed his headset, face puzzled. "Is there a problem?" the co-pilot asked. The captain only shook his head and gave the one sentence he reserved for emergencies. "This is no longer an internal matter. It's federal now." At the same moment in economy class, a woman sitting next to Tasha, around 50, wearing a beige cardigan and solving a crossword, glanced at her for the third time. Her look was no longer distant, but a mix of curiosity and confusion. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked softly. Tasha looked up and nodded slightly. "I'm fine, ma'am." But her eyes told another story. It wasn't fear. It was the alertness of someone who understood that every small move was now being recorded, not by cameras, but by the heart. The woman asked no further questions, but this time she folded her newspaper and set it down. In first class, murmurs began to spread. A man in glasses sitting in the front row leaned toward his wife. "Doesn't look like we're taking off any time soon." She nodded. "Did you see that girl earlier? The one who was asked to leave?" "Not clearly, but something about it felt wrong." Silence returned. But questions now floated in the air, still unanswered yet shared by everyone on board. This flight wasn't just delayed. It was being held back for a reason no one wanted to admit. Not yet. Tasha remained still, her hand gripping her phone. A new message popped up. "FAA. Agents are en route. No one takes off until they've spoken. All conduct is being documented. If anyone harasses you again, tell me immediately." This time Tasha smiled softly, not out of revenge, but because, for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. Inside the aircraft cabin, still anchored at the boarding gate, time seemed to slow down. No one spoke loudly. No music played. But the atmosphere between the rows of seats had shifted entirely. It was no longer the indifference of strangers waiting for a journey, but the feeling that everyone was sitting together in a courtroom, with an unnamed defendant, yet everyone knew exactly who it was. Tasha sat still, eyes fixed on the window, where sunlight streamed through the panes and cast her shadow long across the floor. Her phone rested on the tray table in front of her, screen dark, but she didn't need to check it. Evelyn's last message was etched clearly in her mind. "Stay in your seat. Don't speak to anyone, I'll handle it." From deep within her chest an emotion began to rise. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet certainty. The feeling that someone had finally seen her, acknowledged her, and stood up to do what everyone should have done: defend justice. In the cockpit, Captain Monroe sat in silence, arms crossed. His co-pilot glanced at him occasionally, as if wanting to ask something but always thought better of it. This situation wasn't in any training manual. A flight grounded due to discrimination? Because a teenage girl with a valid first-class ticket was forced to move? Simply because she didn't look like she belonged there? There was no switch to handle something like this, and there was certainly no turning back, not when Evelyn Brooks herself had issued the order to hold the plane. In a high-level office in Washington, D.C., Evelyn was at her desk, her face carved with composure, no excess expression, no sighs or complaints. But everyone in the room knew, whenever Evelyn went quiet for longer than usual, it meant a system was being evaluated. And this time that system was Horizon Airlines, one of the nation's largest carriers. "Give me a rapid report on Flight Attendant Parker," Evelyn said, not looking away from her screen. An assistant stepped forward with a folder. 20 years on the job, no formal complaints. Commended multiple times for maintaining cabin order. Evelyn glanced at the report. Order maintained, but how? No one responded. She turned the monitor toward herself and typed a command into the FAA's internal system. "Urgent. Request cabin audio and passenger log from Flight 263. She didn't wait for authorization. As Director of Aviation Safety, Evelyn had full access to everything she needed to investigate serious misconduct. Tasha knew nothing of what was happening in the halls of power, but she felt that something was changing, not outside, but inside this very aircraft. The air had shifted. The way people looked at her had shifted. Gone was the earlier apathy. Gone were the sideways glances. In their place were longer, deeper looks. A sense of guilt. A sense of, we should have done something earlier. Next to her sat a woman in her 50s wearing a beige cardigan and reading a book. She had seen Tasha bored, had seen her get sent to the back. She had done nothing, just furrowed her brow and turned a page. Now she closed the book and set it in her lap. And unlike most passengers, she turned directly toward Tasha. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Tasha turned her head, gave a small nod. "I'm fine, ma'am." Just 2 words. But they were delivered with a calmness that made the woman feel ashamed. Not because Tasha was accusing her, but because it was painfully clear that this young girl was displaying more composure than any adult in that cabin. In first class, Ms. Parker was beginning to sense something was wrong. Takeoff had been delayed by more than 30 minutes, yet there had been no announcement from the cockpit. The other flight attendants avoided her gaze. No one asked questions, no one chatted. But that very silence unsettled her. "Something's not right," she muttered, trying to reassure herself, but her nerves had started to fray. She stepped toward the cockpit door and knocked softly. No response. Knocked again. A young flight attendant approached, gently intercepting her. "The captain has requested not to be disturbed." "Not to be disturbed? We're nearly an hour delayed," she snapped. The reply was just a look, not angry, not accusing, just the look of someone who knew what was going on, and was letting her face it on her own. In seat 3A, a man wearing a luxury watch, Ronald Hastings, leaned toward the woman next to him. "Looks like we're part of something bigger than we thought." "What do you mean?" "Did you hear about the girl who got sent to the back? I think we're about to get an explanation, but not the kind people are expecting." The woman swallowed hard and looked down. "I think maybe we've all stayed silent for too long." Luis, the young flight attendant, walked slowly down the cabin aisle. He didn't say a word, but his eyes met each passenger's as if silently saying, "You may not have spoken up before, but now none of you are invisible anymore." When he passed Tasha's row, she looked up, and their eyes met. He nodded, a quiet nod. No promise, no pity, just recognition. Tasha returned the look, not meek, not softened. No longer the girl who had been pushed aside for not belonging. She sat there like a witness whose testimony the rules themselves would now have to hear. From the window, a black SUV pulled up beside the boarding ramp. The FAA logo gleamed silently on its door. Only those in the cockpit knew what that meant. No one boarded the plane. No one said a word. But something without a doubt was coming. Ms. Parker stood in the galley, both hands gripping the cold edge of the stainless steel counter. Though there was no one around, she felt as if dozens of eyes were fixed on her, not from the passengers, but from somewhere deep inside her mind. For the first time in years of wearing this uniform, she no longer felt protected by it. It didn't command respect anymore. It didn't grant her trust. And worse now, it might serve as evidence. "This will blow over," she told herself. Just a misunderstanding. Just a small issue blown out of proportion. But even she couldn't believe that anymore, because she knew she hadn't checked the ticket. She hadn't asked nearby passengers. She hadn't checked the manifest. She had simply looked at a young black girl in a hoodie and decided she didn't belong. She had always believed herself to be fair. I was just following procedure, she had often said in crew meetings. But now, in this quiet galley, those words echoed back like a cheap excuse. She remembered the girl's eyes, not pleading, not angry, just quietly, powerfully honest. That composure, more than anything, was what shook her now. A voice came from behind. "Luis, are you okay?" he asked, not harshly, but without softness either. Ms. Parker didn't turn. "I'm fine." "Doesn't seem like it." "What do you want?" She turned, weariness in her eyes. "I just think you should be prepared. The FAA people are on their way." She took a deep breath. "I already apologized. I let her return to her seat. I did everything right after that." Luis shook his head. His gaze softened, but didn't waver. "You don't get it. This isn't about a seat anymore. It's about the way you looked at someone like they didn't have the right to be there." Silence. A thick, heavy silence. "Have you ever thought," Luis continued, "that one look, one reaction, could be enough to bring an entire system to a halt?" Ms. Parker didn't answer. She just leaned against the galley wall, hands braced on the metal frame, as if letting go might cause her to collapse right there in the aisle. Back in the cabin, passengers were shifting quietly in their seats. No one spoke aloud, but the tension had turned into unease. An elderly man in seat 2D removed his glasses and wiped them with the hem of his shirt. Not because they were dirty, but because he couldn't bring himself to look anyone in the eye. He had seen what happened, and said nothing. A pregnant woman in seat 4A leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Do you think we should have said something?" The man didn't respond. He just squeezed her hand gently. Tasha still sat as still as a statue, but inside her a whirlwind churned. She didn't want to be the center of anything. She just wanted to go home, finish her book, and believe that sometimes just living kindly was enough. But today the world had reminded her of something else. Even when you are right, people will still try to push you back if you don't stand your ground. She picked up her phone and reopened Evelyn's last message. "Stay in your seat. Don't say anything. I'll handle it." For the third time, the message made her feel she wasn't alone. But this time, it wasn't just a source of comfort. It was a responsibility. She was being protected, and so she had to remain steady. She had to prove that Evelyn was right to believe in her. She had to hold her silence, not out of fear, but as a choice. A question echoed in her mind, not meant for her, but for everyone else in the cabin. If you see someone being treated unfairly, and say nothing, are you still innocent? That question threaded silently through every gaze in the cabin. It didn't need to be spoken. Its presence alone left a mark. Down in the terminal, 2 FAA officers were climbing the jet bridge stairs. They carried no weapons, no cameras, but their eyes did not look like those of investigators. They looked like collectors, sent to settle a system's long overdue debt. Captain Monroe received confirmation from ground control. He glanced up at the rearview mirror mounted above the cockpit door. Through it, he saw Ms. Parker still in the galley, body slightly slouched, gripping the seat frame like she might fall. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel pity. He simply felt inevitability. A woman who once believed she held authority was now face to face with a truth that nothing could cover up. The cabin door opened without warning, but that small sound thundered like a storm in the minds of those who sat waiting. A tall woman stepped in first, her black uniform of the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, hugged a posture carved by discipline. Pinned to her chest, a silver nameplate gleamed, "Officer Rhodes." Right behind her came a man in a dark gray suit wearing an internal operations badge. They didn't smile. They didn't rush. They didn't come in with threats. But their very presence said everything that needed to be said. Luis was the first to see them. He gave a slight nod. No questions. He simply stepped aside. Officer Rodes's met the captain's eyes as he stood near the cockpit. He gave her a slight tilt of the head, a silent agreement. She advanced to first class and stopped in the aisle. Every passenger followed her with their gaze. No one spoke. Eyes locked on the woman in uniform and the half-closed door of the galley that now felt heavier than steel. "Flight Attendant Parker," Officer Rhodes called, not loudly, but her voice rang clear through the silent cabin like a summons. The door opened. Ms. Parker stepped out. Her posture was no longer brisk. Her face had lost all confidence. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes swept the cabin as if searching for a place to hide. "That's me," she said softly, but without enough pride to lift her chin. "We need you to come with us to a designated area to report on the incident," said Officer Rodes's. "Before this aircraft is cleared for departure, the matter must undergo preliminary review." Ms. Parker nodded, but as she stepped forward, her eyes involuntarily drifted to the economy section. And there, like a full stop to every excuse, sat Tasha. The small girl in the gray hoodie, still seated upright, her gaze steady and calm, reflected the error like a polished mirror. She didn't scowl, didn't glare, but her refusal to look at Ms. Parker, that was what broke her. Parker paused for a second, then continued walking. As she passed by Tasha's row, her steps slowed, as if pulled by a silent force from that unspoken gaze. "Ms. Holloway," Officer Rhodes said gently, "we'd like you to come to the front with us." Tasha nodded. She stood slowly, adjusted the strap of her backpack. She spoke to no one, looked at no one. But as she walked forward, an invisible shift stirred in the cabin air, like someone was speaking, without saying a word. She and Ms. Parker moved in parallel toward the front of the plane. No one led them. No one blocked them. Louis stood to the side, eyes fixed on the pair. As they passed, he leaned slightly and murmured, "She doesn't need you to say much. She needs you to mean it." Ms. Parker didn't reply, not out of anger, but because her throat at that moment felt like it had swallowed a stone that hadn't melted. In the cabin, the passengers began whispering, not loud but enough that it couldn't be ignored. They leaned in, wondering what had happened. But what they didn't say was the most important thing. "I saw it, and I didn't do anything." Outside on the jet bridge, 2 FAA officers waited. No handcuffs, no threatening demeanor. But they carried something far more powerful than orders, the authority to record the truth. The door to the technical cabin opened. Ms. Parker stepped in first, followed by Tasha and the 2 federal agents. Inside that tight space, lit by cold fluorescent lights, every expression became impossible to hide. A plain metal chair sat at the center of the room. Tasha took her seat, back straight, backpack placed neatly at her feet. Ms. Parker sat across from her. This wasn't a courtroom, but every glance, every breath, every word spoken next would become a record in the system. "We need you to recount the full incident, clearly and truthfully," said the lead investigator. His voice wasn't threatening, but sharp as a blade. Ms. Parker blinked. She began. She looked like someone who didn't belong there. Silence. Everyone in the room understood. That was the first honest sentence Ms. Parker had uttered in her entire career. Tasha said nothing. She didn't have to. The truth had finally spoken for her. Tasha stepped out of the technical cabin, her posture upright, eyes forward, the same worn backpack still slung across her shoulders. No one welcomed her. No one cleared a path. But people moved instinctively, stepping aside as if confronted by a silent reminder that some wrongs weren't theirs to cause, but they let them happen. From the front of the cabin, Luis nodded at her, a wordless greeting. He didn't smile, but in his eyes there was respect. Tasha returned to seat 3B, her original seat, the rightful seat, the seat she had been forced to abandon while everyone remained silent. She didn't sit right away. She stood for a moment, eyes scanning the cabin as if to imprint the faces of those who had witnessed, and said nothing. There was no anger in her gaze, no accusation, but the weight of her silence made others question themselves. Then she sat, fastened her seatbelt, placed her backpack at her feet, folded her hands over her lap, eyes looking straight ahead. No more pitying glances, no more careless whispers, only a heavy silence like fog settling over every row. In the back, a middle-aged woman kept her head bowed, hands clenched in her lap. She had watched it all, when Tasha was removed, when Ms. Parker raised her voice. She had almost said something, a protest, a simple question, but she hadn't. Now she asked herself, why? Was it fear of making waves, believing it wasn't her place? Or was it because the girl didn't look like someone who belonged in that seat? In seat 2D, Ronald Hastings, the man with the expensive watch, stared blankly out the window. His gaze no longer held the sharpness it did when he boarded. Now, it was the look of someone who no longer recognized himself, in the moment that had mattered most. Beside him, his wife spoke for the first time in over an hour. When the girl was removed, you saw it all. Why didn't you say something? Ronald didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, I thought I didn't need to. But clearly, I should have. The truth is often that simple, and that's painful. Meanwhile, in the rear galley, Ms. Parker had slumped into the jump seat. Her eyes stared blankly into the distance. No more chief flight attendant. No more authority. No more carefully controlled appearance. Only a woman who had just shattered the image she spent 20 years building. The investigator's questions still echoed in her mind. Why did you only doubt that girl? Did you confirm with the passenger manifest? And worse than the questions was her answer, unprompted, unrehearsed, just slipped from her lips because she didn't look like someone in first class. That sentence had torn apart every excuse she had ever clung to. It turned every glance in that cabin into a blade pointed silently in her direction. One of the attendants from the economy entered the galley, handing her a cup of water. Here, drink this. You look pale. Ms. Parker took it. Her hand shook. The water rattled in the cup. Do you think I still have a chance? She asked, her voice raw and hoarse. The flight attendant hesitated, then said softly, Maybe. But not for you. For someone else to finally see what needs to change. Silence. Ms. Parker closed her eyes, rested her head against the galley wall. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. But inside her something collapsed without sound. Because when you're forced to face a truth you created, the pain doesn't come from others. It comes from the question no one dares to answer. What have I become? Back in the passenger cabin, Captain Monroe stepped out of the cockpit. His expression was calm. His eyes scanned the cabin. Then he picked up the intercom mic and spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We have just received clearance from the FAA. The flight will resume in approximately 15 minutes. In the meantime, we ask that you remain in your seats, and thank you for your understanding. He paused. We hope this flight, and every flight, delivers not just service, but a sense of fairness to all who board. No applause, no comments, but many heads bowed, not in shame, but because for the first time they realized that silence isn't always neutral. Sometimes it's complicity. Tasha remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh. But in her eyes there was a subtle shift, as if a small weight she'd carried was finally set down. No one crowned her a hero. She didn't need them to, because perhaps in a world so loud, the strength to be silent in the right way, it's a kind of power. Flight 263 of Horizon Airlines finally took off, nearly 2 hours late. But no one complained. No one rushed. Everyone on board seemed to understand that this plane wasn't just carrying them to another city. It was carrying a living story about how people see one another, judge one another, and sometimes choose silence when a voice is needed most. Tasha remained in seat 3B, seatbelt fastened, eyes gently closed. She wasn't sleeping. She was listening. Listening to the hum of the engines, the hushed whispers, and the heavy silence of those slowly realizing maybe they too were part of the problem. The plane cruised smoothly through layers of cloud, but in Washington, D.C., a storm was beginning to form. At FAA headquarters, an emergency closed-door meeting had been called. Evelyn Brooks entered the room with a file marked Priority. She placed it on the table, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the attendees, FAA legal counsel, regional airspace supervisors, the director of communications, and a liaison from federal affairs. "We're not handling an in-flight incident," Evelyn began. "We're dealing with a system that allowed public discrimination to occur, and no one stopped it." One member pushed back. "But it's still an isolated case, one flight attendant, one impulsive act." Evelyn cut him off, her eyes steady. "And how many isolated cases have been buried? Because no one stepped forward. This time is different because the person who was removed is a girl I consider my own family. But I don't want this to end with a corporate apology and a memo tucked in a drawer." She opened her laptop and projected an image onto the screen. Tasha, calm-faced, clutching her backpack. A still from the airport surveillance camera just before boarding. That girl doesn't need an apology. She needs faith in the system, and that system is us. No one replied. But every glance around the room said the same thing. Evelyn wasn't bluffing. In the sky, Flight 263 began its descent. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. Passengers were asked to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. But the atmosphere was no longer the same. Luis, the only flight attendant who had spoken up, moved down the aisle. He wasn't checking bags or belts. He was simply looking, not with scrutiny, not with expectation. Just the quiet gaze of someone who had chosen not to look away, and was waiting to see who else would do the same. In seat 2D, Ronald Hastings put his phone down, fingers tightening. A message from his wife. "What will you say when the press asks?" He didn't know. Maybe he'd stay silent, like when the girl was removed. But maybe not this time. As the plane touched down, the shift was immediate. There was no applause, no audible sighs of relief. Instead, everyone waited to see what would happen once the aircraft came to a full stop at the gate. Captain Monroe stepped out of the cockpit, holding the cabin mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received notification from the FAA. A federal representative will be boarding shortly to initiate a special protocol. Please remain in your seats and follow instructions as provided." At that moment, no one dared to ask, "What's going on?" Because they already knew, and they were watching themselves become part of the process. The cabin door opened. 2 figures stepped in. They weren't airline staff. They weren't technicians. One was a federal investigator. The other, wearing a marked badge, was Brooks, Evelyn, Director of Aviation Safety. The cabin fell completely still. At the back of the plane, Ms. Parker stood pale, blood drained from her face. She hadn't expected Evelyn to come personally, and even more so, she hadn't expected that Evelyn's presence was not for punishment, but for something else, to acknowledge publicly. Evelyn walked slowly down the aisle. She didn't stare, but her presence alone made every passenger glance inward. She stopped at seat 3B. Tasha sat there composed, just as she had been when she first boarded. No one could hear what Evelyn said, but they saw her lean down, gently place a hand on Tasha's shoulder, and nod. Recognition didn't come with applause. It came with presence. The plane touched down with a soft screech of its wheels, just like always, but no one clapped. No one sighed in relief. The cabin was blanketed in a tense silence, not out of fear, but because everyone was waiting for something inevitable. Tasha was the last to disembark. No one stopped her. No one called her name. But every passenger watched her, as if witnessing a new chapter unfold before them, uncertain which side of the page they stood on. Evelyn followed just behind, saying nothing, but her presence alone was a declaration. This is a public matter, and it will not be buried. 3 hours later, the first photo surfaced online. A passenger from the economy cabin had discreetly snapped a blurry image of the moment Tasha was forced from her seat. A young black girl standing still, backpack on her shoulders, eyes lowered, a flight attendant pointing toward the back. The caption read simply, "That girl had a valid ticket." I saw it, but they still sent her away. The post spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, a second clip emerged. This time, the moment Ms. Parker was called out by a federal investigator in the middle of the cabin. A passenger in row 2 had captured everything. The calm but commanding voice of the FAA officer. "We need you to explain the entire incident." The video was 1 minute and 10 seconds long. No edits, no effects. 20 million views in 6 hours. Flight 263 hit national trending. At Horizon Airlines headquarters, an emergency meeting was held in a closed, fully curtained conference room. CEO Martin Raines, hair graying at the temples, tapped his pen against the table. On the projection screen, screenshots from viral Twitter threads, TikTok clips, YouTube replays, and national news bulletins. A PR advisor spoke up. "We need a response, fast. If we delay any longer, the brand may not recover." Another executive chimed in. "This isn't just about one employee's action. It's a question of our values." A lawyer whispered gravely, "The FAA has requested full passenger logs and cabin recordings. If they prove discriminatory conduct, we're facing more than just PR damage." All eyes turned to the CEO. He exhaled slowly. "Release a statement, but not some hollow apology. Make it real, from me, in my own words." The press release went out overnight. "We confirm that a serious incident occurred aboard Flight 263. A passenger was removed from her assigned first-class seat despite holding a valid ticket. We apologize to Ms. Holloway and the public. We are fully cooperating with the FAA in a comprehensive investigation. The involved employee has been placed on leave. An emergency unconscious bias retraining program will be implemented company-wide." The post didn't erase the outrage, but it contained the fire for now. In a small apartment in D.C., Tasha sat on the couch, hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. Evelyn sat across from her. On the TV, the evening news banner scrolled. 16-year-old girl triggers FAA intervention. Passengers speak out for justice. Tasha said nothing. Her eyes didn't blink, but her chest churned with emotion. She whispered inwardly, "I didn't even do anything. I just sent a message." Evelyn set her cup down, looked her straight in the eye. "You didn't have to do anything, just not staying silent when you were wronged." That was enough. At the airport, Luis, the young flight attendant, received a text from a colleague. "That flight, 263 thing. You were on that plane, right? People are talking about that girl. What did you see?" Luis didn't respond right away. He stared out at the pitch-black sky beyond the terminal windows, then finally typed, I saw a girl braver than the whole cabin, and one grown-up, finally learning to listen, decades too late. 1 week after the incident, at Horizon Airlines headquarters, a special meeting was broadcast internally to every branch across the United States. On the large screen, CEO Martin Raines stood at center stage, no cue cards in hand. His eyes were tired but resolute. "We're not here to defend our reputation. We're here to admit our failure. We allowed a young, legitimate passenger to be removed from her seat because of a glance, a presumption, a reflex so deeply ingrained that no one recognized it as wrong until she refused to accept it." Following his speech, a series of new policies were announced. Mandatory retraining across the entire system, 3 months nationwide with no exceptions. Dual verification protocol. No flight attendant may change a passenger seat without scanning and system confirmation. Anonymous discrimination reporting system, linked directly to the FAA's Oversight Division. And finally, a clear message. Chief Flight Attendant Amanda Parker has been officially terminated from the company. Meanwhile, at the FAA office, Evelyn Brooke sat before the final report. She read slowly, line by line, as though reading for every moment in the past when she couldn't intervene in time. At the bottom of the document were 2 signatures, one of the lead investigators, one from her, and below them a handwritten note. "Not because you're special, but because you refused to be invisible." Tasha, at that moment, was sitting on a stone bench beside the schoolyard, a cup of hot cocoa in her hands. No one crowded around. No cameras clicked. She was reading. Turning the pages of her book with steady fingers, at peace, as if what had happened was merely a chapter in her life, not the entire story. A classmate approached, hands trembling. "Tasha, I just wanted to say, I saw it that day, but I didn't say anything. I'm sorry." Tasha looked up and smiled gently. "It's okay. Just make sure next time you don't stay silent." There is no sharper lesson than that reply. As for Ms. Parker, the internal investigation had concluded. She no longer wore a uniform, no name badge, no title. Just a woman seated in a final review room, facing a cold plastic sign, Testimony FAA, Division of Discriminatory Conduct. A federal officer asked, "Looking back now, where do you think you went wrong?" She stayed quiet for a long time, then spoke softly like an exhale. "I was wrong to believe I knew who belonged, and who didn't." That evening, a news anchor shared the story on national television. The girl didn't chant slogans, she didn't bang on tables, she didn't live stream. She sent one message and kept her seat. And in doing so, she made an entire industry rethink its own. Final message. In this story, Tasha is no fairy tale hero. She didn't take the stage, she didn't need applause, but it was her silence at the right moment, her calm posture in the face of injustice. That forced an entire society to listen. Because respect is not a reward for those who look the part. Respect is a default, a ticket that requires no permission, and no need to look like someone else. Flight 263 will never be remembered for its destination. It will be remembered for bringing an entire system to a halt mid-air, because one young girl dared not rise when she was told to disappear. Real-world lesson. No one has to look like they deserve respect, because respect is a default right. Tasha didn't have to dress up. She didn't have to prove her status. She didn't need anyone's validation. All she needed was a valid ticket and her presence. That alone gave her the right to sit in her seat, yet the world still carries unspoken biases. And only when someone dares to stand still in the face of them does the truth come to light. Respect isn't a reward, it's the standard. Silence is not always neutral, Sometimes it's complicity. In that airplane cabin, dozens witnessed the injustice toward Tasha. No one shouted, no one objected. Everyone chose silence. But that very silence was what allowed injustice to exist. We may not always be the ones making the mistake, but if we don't act when it unfolds before us, then we become part of what allows it to continue. Kindness is not measured by thoughts. It's measured by actions, or the lack thereof. One small act at the right time can shift an entire system. Tasha sent just one message: no shouting, no filming, no confrontation. But her decision not to give up her seat, to remain still in silence, became a ringing bell that echoed far beyond the plane. It forced the FAA, the airline, and the public to take action. Change doesn't always begin with a storm. Sometimes it starts with one person, refusing to be pushed back. You don't need to be loud to make change. You just need not to back down. True strength isn't loud resistance. It's quiet resolve. Tasha didn't need a podium. Evelyn didn't need to shout into the cameras. But their composure amid a noisy world, it was what made their voices resonate. Because strength isn't about volume. It's about how firm your stance is. Silence, when it's not born of fear, is the greatest declaration. I matter, and I don't need to yell to remind you of that. Change doesn't come from apology. It comes from the courage to make it right. The airline wasn't forgiven simply for saying sorry. It was accepted again only after changing its policies, accepting consequences, and committing not to repeat the same mistakes. In every organization, from corporations to governments, admitting fault should never be the end. It must be the beginning. An apology only has value when paired with meaningful.